Female cop pulled over a black man, accused him of theft. Turns out he is a Navy captain. What happened next will shock you. Imagine driving home after a long journey, only to be stopped on the side of the road, accused of a crime you didn't commit. What would go through your mind? Would you feel angry, scared, or helpless? Captain Elijah Daniels, a distinguished officer of the United States Navy, had been counting down the days until he could see his family again. Tonight was the night. After months at sea, he was finally home, ready to surprise his wife and children. But he hadn't anticipated the flashing red and blue lights filling his rearview mirror, or the sinking feeling that came with them. He pulled over, his heart beating faster as he waited for what came next. A young female officer stepped out of her cruiser, her hand hovering near her holster. She took a few careful steps toward him, her eyes hard and piercing in the beam of her flashlight. "Driver," she called out, her voice firm but with an edge of suspicion, "step out of the vehicle." Elijah hesitated, confused. Why was he being stopped? He hadn't broken any laws. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady but puzzled. Her eyes narrowed, scrutinizing his every movement. "We had a report of a theft nearby. A man fitting your description, black male, mid-40s, driving a dark sedan." The weight of her words sank in like a stone. "Fitting your description." Elijah felt his breath hitch. He realized then that this wasn't about him as an individual. It was about him as a black man driving in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Ma'am, I just got back from deployment. I'm a Navy captain, and I've been traveling all day," he explained, his voice calm and respectful. "My ID is in my wallet if you'd like to see it." But the officer, whose name tag read Officer Grant, kept her eyes trained on him, skepticism hardening her expression. "Keep your hands where I can see them," she instructed coldly. She didn't budge. Her flashlight pointed directly into his eyes. "Would you start to feel panic if your identity was questioned or your integrity doubted? What would you do in that moment? Stand your ground or give in to frustration?" Elijah nodded, deciding to comply and keep the situation calm. He knew better than to make sudden movements. "Officer Grant, I'm just trying to get home to my family. My name is Captain Elijah Daniels. My credentials are in my pocket." But instead of acknowledging his words, she signaled for him to turn around. "Put your hands on the car," she demanded, her voice sharp. "You're going to be detained until we can sort this out." What happens when years of honor and service mean nothing? When, in one moment, you're stripped of your dignity and treated like a common criminal? Elijah could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, watching from their windows. Were they wondering what he'd done? Or were they silently rooting for him, hoping he'd clear this up? As Officer Grant moved closer, another patrol car pulled up. "Back up." Another officer, male this time, joined her, glancing at Elijah with the same wary eyes. It was a scene Elijah had seen too often. Officers arriving, escalating rather than de-escalating. "Are you sure this is the guy?" the male officer asked her in a low voice, glancing suspiciously at Elijah. "He matches the description," Officer Grant replied, her eyes still locked on him. Elijah could feel the frustration building inside him, but he kept his voice even. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but if you just take a look at my ID, this can all be resolved quickly. Would you be able to stay calm, or would the injustice of it all start to chip away at you?" But she didn't respond. Instead, she instructed him to keep his hands on the hood of the car. And there he stood, a decorated Navy captain, humiliated and helpless on the side of the road. Eventually, a third officer arrived, a sergeant who seemed to sense the tension. She observed the situation, noting the way Elijah stood with quiet dignity, and she approached with a more open mind. "What's going on here?" she asked Officer Grant, who explained her suspicion. The sergeant listened, then turned to Elijah, finally noticing his Navy ID card partially visible in his pocket. "Captain Daniels, is it?" the sergeant asked, her voice laced with recognition and respect. Elijah nodded, relieved to have someone finally acknowledge him. The sergeant turned to Officer Grant, her face a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Did you ask him to show ID? Did you verify anything before detaining him?" Officer Grant faltered, realizing her mistake. The sergeant sighed, a hard look in her eyes. "This man has served our country for over 20 years. You can't assume someone's guilt based on a vague description. This is unacceptable." Would this moment end in just an apology, or should there be more accountability? How would you feel if an apology was the only reparation for such an injustice? As the sergeant formally apologized to Elijah, Officer Grant stood there, clearly shaken by the gravity of her actions. Later that night, disciplinary action would be taken against her, a clear message that profiling and presumptive guilt would not be tolerated. But for Elijah, the damage was already done. The apology felt hollow, a temporary bandage over a wound that ran far deeper. He'd been humiliated and reminded that, despite all his achievements, his identity still rendered him vulnerable. What should change? What would it take to end these wrongful assumptions? Elijah's story, unfortunately, is one of many, a tale echoing the harsh reality faced by countless others. In the days that followed, Elijah's story would inspire a community-wide conversation on justice, accountability, and the dangers of prejudice. And though the experience scarred him, Elijah hoped his ordeal would open others' eyes, so that one day no one else would have to face the same.
If you've watched this far, comment which country you're watching from and leave a 100 in the comment section, because you are type of person that likes to finish what they started. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified whenever we drop new videos.